Welcome, Yarabun, to Season 1, Episode 4 of the Gifted Present podcast, where you'll be unpacking life with your host, Jess, your upcoming lifestyle blogger, website coming soon, and myself, Sehlynn, your internet friend and hype girl. Hey, Jess, what's good?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just really excited to be recording our 4th episode now. I can't believe it. And we're finally on YouTube.
Finally. Should we disclose that we plan to do this for our first episode of AAPI, but we completely screwed up the video?
We sure did. What, do you have landscape and I had profile view? Or portrait?
So that's why we randomly have our second episode of AAPI month, not the first.
Oh my goodness.
We good. We're this.
Good. But now you see our faces because we figured this out. So woo woo. Before we begin today's episode, we wanted to mention that starting this episode, we will be highlighting and supporting small businesses that are owned by people of color. With everything going on in this world, we believe that it's important to support each other during this time because in the end, we are stronger together. Also, quick disclaimer, we are not sponsored in any way. We just wanted to do this to show support for our communities. We also asked our listeners to recommend businesses and creators, so we will be spotlighting one of the recommendations at the end of each episode. So please stay tuned. And sneak peek, we will be talking about Sabbatical Beauty today. So Jess, what's our topic today?
Yeah, so today we are going to be unpacking growing up in immigrant families. So both Sehlynn and I were born into immigrant families and are second-generation Koreans. So surprisingly and also unsurprisingly, not a whole lot of research has been done on Asian immigrant families in the U.S. compared to other racial minority groups. So it was a bit of a challenge for me to find recent studies done on Asian immigrant families for us to talk about, but that is okay because we still have a lot of stuff to talk about. I did find a few facts, and then I also figured that we could spend this episode talking more about our personal experiences growing up in immigrant families. And I think that not only would this be a great way for our audience to get to know us better, it'll also provide some free because we Asians love free stuff, free qualitative data for any of our listeners who are university students majoring in Asian American Studies. And to these guys in particular, we are rooting for you. Asian American Studies is definitely a legitimate major, and we need more of you guys to represent us. And so make sure you complete your studies, get your PhDs, and reference us in your dissertation. So I wanted to start by asking you, Sehlynn, this question. How did your parents end up moving to the U.S., and what was the reason behind them immigrating here?
So I called up my mom and my dad, and they gave me very vague descriptions of how they came to the U.S.
Oh, because immigrants love their secrets.
They don't want to tell me the full story, but how it goes is my dad's mom moved to Chicago first, and then my dad's younger sister and then her husband followed right after, and then my dad followed. Oh. And then there was like a small gap for a few years where my mom and dad were separated because he was in America first, and then my mom was brought over a few years later. And when I asked, why, obviously it's to follow the American dream. I mean, I wish I had something more elaborate to say of why they moved here, but they kept it simple. It's I was chasing the American dream. How about you, Jess? What about your parents?
That's so typical. Because I have a really vague story too.
Why aren't they giving us any details?
I don't know. They love their secrets. It's so weird. But yeah, my parents, they actually got married in Korea first, and then they came to the U.S. in the late 80s, and they were in their mid-20s, late 20s. And my dad basically had a student visa for pursuing an MBA. But what ended up happening is that the company that was sponsoring him and his education, they got into some financial difficulty, so they could no longer support him. So he was faced with the choice of either going back to Korea or staying in America. And both my parents just agreed that there were probably a lot more opportunities in the US than in Korea, so they decided to stay. And then they spent more than half of their lives working odd jobs. So, like, they did the typical owning a electronics store, because that's a great idea. They worked at restaurants. And then my dad even, I just found this out recently, but he was in agriculture, and he would leave our family for weeks at a time to harvest produce. So he was gone. And I don't remember this. And I feel so bad.
Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know that.
I didn't either.
Who knew? Dad was like into agriculture.
Yeah, I didn't
That's
either.
so nice.
And he was just gone for my childhood, and I didn't notice.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So, like, what was your family like, or like, what did daily life look like for you guys?
It was very, I don't know, I feel like it's very typical compared to a lot of immigrant families. I mean, my parents were always working. So, you know, when they're working, we're at school. And when we were younger, we had like an old grandma that would be our babysitter. But then like eventually when we got older, like we would just be home by ourselves after school watching Dragon Ball. How about you?
Yeah, for my family, my mom actually chose to be a stay-at-home mom until I was about 5 years old. And I think that's why, like, my dad was gone for so long, because he had to pick up the slack and make more income. Yeah. And he was actually very supportive of this, though, and they both came to that decision together. So a lot of my early childhood was spent with my mom, actually. And sometimes when money was especially tight, or if an opportunity showed up, she'd work part-time somewhere, and then she would have to take me along with her. And then it was like that until I started going to school, and then my mom started working full-time. And then after that, since I had an older brother, we were always just home alone a lot. And I think it was just like different back then because, you know, we honestly, I think we just grew up in one of the best times in history because it was pre-internet. So like when the weather was nice, we'd play outside at the park or ride our bikes. And then we also played a lot of video games because N64 was out. And then once the internet came around, like, do you remember like Neopets and like Candy Stand and Shockwave games? Like those
I got
were
in
all
trouble
around.
for Neopets. I'll be up all night trying to get those Neopets back.
Okay, but the thing is, though, is like since we had dial-up, we would get in trouble too, and my parents would find out because every time they'd call to check up on us, like they couldn't get a hold of us. So that also kept us accountable. And so once we got in trouble, we would just go play something else. So we'd be outside. So I just feel like we grew up in a very like fun time.
We did. That was like such a transition too with technology, and I just remember that. Don't you miss dial-up? It's amazing.
It's such. Yeah. So I guess like overall, like what do you think, or how do you feel about growing up in an immigrant family? What are your thoughts on your experience?
Yeah, for me, I think it depends like which time period of my life we're talking about, because when I was like specifically a kid, I remember loving the idea of being different, and I loved the fact that I was Korean. I was really proud that I was Korean, and I was in a neighborhood where there was a lot of other immigrant families. So honestly, the Asian kids were the cool kids at school. But yeah, so like I was actually really proud of like my heritage and culture. And I remember like even in like, I think it was third grade, we had like you know, cultural day or culture day or whatever, and like everybody brought their own special dish from their culture, and we all shared it with each other. So like growing up with that, I always like loved the idea of diversity. But things really changed for me when we moved to a new neighborhood starting the fourth grade, and it was a predominantly white neighborhood. So I kind of felt out of place because I no longer felt like I was a cool kid. So yeah, it was a bit confusing, and I think that's where like the whole identity struggle really started to happen for me, because like I like, you know, would go to work with my parents like down South Chicago, and it's a black neighborhood with like Asian merchants, and that was a totally different culture. So I grew up like listening to hip hop and TLC and like, you know, Waterfalls and, you know, like Scrubs and Destiny's Child and all of that stuff. So I still really carried that culture with me everywhere I went. So like when I was in the new neighborhood, like starting the 4th grade, like I remember people would be like, why are you acting black? And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm not acting black. But it was just like things that like I've learned from like black culture, and I like things that, so I was like proud of like being in that hip hop area, and then also proud of being Korean, and then feeling really lost in this new neighborhood where I felt like no one really understood me.
Yeah.
So a lot of identity issues.
For sure. And I think like we talked about this before about finding that spot where you belong, because I don't know about other minority groups, but it just feels like with immigrant families, you just pick up everything because everything is a clean slate to you. And so like similar to you, I think like I used to be really proud of being a part of an immigrant family and growing up in that setting, because in general, I feel like we're portrayed as very resilient. So life gets tough, but we just keep working and working and working until we achieve the American dream. And I thought of my family like that for a while because my parents they did achieve financial success in the end, you know, but the more and more I think about my family though, I'm realizing that we have like a lot of trauma that we don't really talk about. And so like, I just think that I have now this mixed, complex feelings of growing up in an immigrant family because yes, you know, we definitely grew stronger. And a lot of times when I face challenges in my life now, most of the time I'm like, oh, I've been through worse. I can handle this, you know, but at the same time, I think because we were under such chronic stress for so long, like that really affected us psychologically. And so I know, at least for myself, like I'm still processing through a lot of my experiences.
Yeah, I feel the same. I feel like more as an adult now because like I didn't really process it as a kid.
Yeah. I mean, how could you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I guess like, I mean, I'm very curious, like what are some specific things that you liked growing up in an immigrant family?
I thought it was cool that I knew how to speak Korean. I'll be busting that out in middle school and they'll be like, what you trying to say? I'll be like, I'm talking in Korean. They're like, can you say it again? And then usually people want me to say their name in Korean, but the real thing is like there is no literal translation for Lauren. I'm sorry. Lauren? I don't know. Yeah. But I don't know. I think being bilingual like made me feel more confident as a person just because I felt like I had an extra skill. Yeah.
So on my end, I think one specific thing that I liked about growing up in an immigrant family is that my parents tried hard in everything. And I feel like that's a very like staple characteristic to have is you have very hardworking parents.
Yeah.
And they weren't just hardworking in terms of providing for us financially, but they really tried to value family, which I think was very important to them because unlike your family, my parents were the only ones out of their whole families to move to the US. And so to them, like my brother and I were super important, and it was important that all of us were really close. And so I remember like even though my parents were really busy, they really made an effort for us to stay as a family. And so for example, we planned a road trip to Niagara Falls. And so we're driving to New York. And then halfway through the drive, we had to stop for the night. And so we slept at a Motel 6. And I just thought it was like the coolest thing ever, like freaking Motel 6, because I've never slept outside of my house other than like in camping grounds. So I was like, what are these mattresses? We have towels and blankets. And I just was like, this is the best vacation ever. And so when I went to school, like in the fall, one of my assignments was to write and share about the best thing I did that summer. And so I wrote about sleeping at Motel 6. It wasn't even about Niagara Falls. I was just so blown away by Motel 6 that I even drew the logo, like bright red and blue. Being like, it was so amazing. And then my teacher was dying. And then she showed my mom. And my mom just laughed in my face.
That's amazing. I love that you have such a memory about Motel 6.
I know. So like even now I'm just like Holiday Inn, Motel 6, Motel 6. So I guess that's just like my long-winded way of saying that. Like, I love that my family grew up with like that collectivist culture still embodied in us, where family is super important.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point because it made me really reflect about, I mean, honestly, I think the reason why I had a hard time with that question was we talk about childhood trauma. I'm still going through a healing process.
Yeah.
For me, it was like kind of hard to think about all the positive things, but I think about I really think about that concept of family. That's something that my mom really taught me too, was that I mean, yeah, we have like one immediate family here, but my mom doesn't have any other family here. It's only my dad's little sister's family, and my grandma passed away. So this idea of like being with your family, like cherishing your siblings, respecting your elders, you know, all of that was just so important. And I really do appreciate that I had that, because I feel like it really shaped me to be the person I am today, like to appreciate certain things, you know? And I think that if it wasn't for that part of our culture, like I wouldn't be the way that I am. I wouldn't know how to appreciate certain things.
I was actually reading up on some stuff, and a study was done in 2013, and the data showed that for Asian immigrant families, they gathered a common theme that in the majority of these families, there was the presence of chronic stress, which is something that I talked about briefly earlier. And specific things that stressed out these families included acculturation, which is adjusting to a different culture, family relationships, employment, and finances. So I'm just curious, with these 4 things that I listed, do you have any specific memories related to any of them?
Yeah, it's like, which one do I choose to share? I think if I just speak generally and not specifically, I think language barrier, like that language barrier is definitely something that speaks out to me when you ask me this question. But I think also like the different cultures and having to adapt to that, you know, I think not only was a struggle for me, but it was also a struggle for my parents, because you're so Korean, you in your mindset, culturally, you have your traditions, and then you have a Korean looking kid that is Korean to a certain degree, but is also very American. So like, I think one specific story that I can share, I mean, it's like when I like moved out of my parents' house for the first time. I don't think everybody goes through this, and I don't think every Asian family is like this, but I was told that you don't move out until you get married. Like you stay with your parents. And I'm the middle child, so I have an older sister and a younger brother. So like, you know, my sister is so responsible, and I really admire her for that. So I moved out first, is what I'm trying to say. It didn't sit well. And I was 26 at the time, going on 27. And I like moved out, like I think a month before my 27th birthday. And they had such a huge problem with it because they could not comprehend the idea of me wanting to find my independence. It also like, I think as I got older too, I felt like started to feel a little bit embarrassed about it, because when I would like hang out with people like around my age or older than me that weren't Asian, they would ask me, and they're like, okay, so how old are you? And why are you still living at your parents? And it was almost like I became the laughing stock. Like, she's 26 years old, still living with her parents. But it's like, no, culturally, like I was told, like, don't believe me. It's not that I can't move out. It's not that I don't want to. They just won't let me.
Yeah.
You know, and it's more than just won't let me. It's also, I don't want to disrespect them or cause any like rift. But I mean, obviously, I moved out and it didn't sit well with them. And I mean, I was disowned. I mean, to be honest, for like, what, a week? They took me back.
Because it's family.
Yeah. But like, I think, and then, you know, it was after I moved out when I started to change, and, you know, my relationship with my parents got a little different too. They started to realize, oh, okay, I see what she wanted. But it was really hard for them to understand like that idea of independence.
When you were talking about your non-Korean friends not understanding and almost ridiculing you, I felt the same exact way, where people just could not comprehend why I would stay with my parents for so long.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's as much of a trend as it used to be in Korea, but in Korea, like the oldest son would continue to have their parents live with them until they pass away, because there isn't really a such thing as nursing homes in Korea. Now there are, but back in the day, it's like you are your parents' retirement. And so you had to take care of them till death do us part, you know?
Yeah. I think about it too, like, I don't know if your parents said this, but they're like, why are you being so selfish? You know, I think that's one thing I still struggle with, even though they don't think that way anymore.
Yeah.
But it kind of stuck, and I was like, was I being really selfish? You know? Because that's why I think it took me so long to move out. I didn't want to just be thinking of myself.
Yeah.
But I was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to admit it, like, it comes to a point where you are an adult and you want to try your own things, but you also want to respect your parents because that's how you grew up.
Well, I also do like that you bring up language, because I think like that's one of the biggest challenges that I've had growing up in an immigrant family. And so I just remember from a very early age that I couldn't really depend on my parents when it came to communicating my needs.
Yeah.
And where that really started is when I was entering into kindergarten. For some reason, I had to take a placement test to see if I would go into an ESL classroom, so English as a second language classroom, or if I can join the rest of the kids. And I took that test, and then we went to visit the school principal to get our results, and it was my mom and me. And the principal just took one look at us, and she didn't say it in a mean way, but she was just like, oh, yeah, Jessica will be in the ESL class. And my mom was just very taken aback by this, and she was like, no, my daughter speaks English. She doesn't know Korean that well, but she couldn't communicate that. And so she just walked out of the office with me and was like, okay, I guess my daughter might end up joining this ESL class, and we'll see what happens. And then luckily what ended up happening is that, again, this sounds a little racist. She was a really nice principal, by the way, but she comes running out after us and she's like, I'm so sorry. Like, I mistaken you for a different family. Jessica's not in the ESL class. And after that, like, that was the first time where my mom wasn't this invincible person to me, you know, where she couldn't protect me. And so after that, I remember, like, I would learn how to fill out all of my school forms so that all I needed was my parents' signature. And then during parent-teacher conferences, like, my mom would step out of the conference room, and then in Korean, she'd be asking me, like, oh, I didn't understand this one part. Like, what was your teacher saying? And luckily, I was a goody two-shoes in those days, so I told the truth, you know? I didn't take advantage of it. I should have, but I didn't. And so, like, language, I just have very complicated feelings towards it, because you know how, like, you know my personality. I rarely feel jealousy towards other people. But, like, the one thing that I feel extreme jealousy for is when I see a mom and a daughter and they're able to talk to each other in the same language, because I never got that. And so I remember growing up, like, as a teenager, I was so embarrassed, and I would, like, yell at my parents all the time, being like, just pick up a book or watch a movie, like, learn English. You've lived here for over 10 years now. Why can't you just learn? But as I got older, I realized, like, that embarrassment was me just trying to express my frustration and this wistful feeling that I have that I can't communicate with my parents. And I think especially during that time when you're just, like, going through puberty and figuring out life and becoming an adult, like, you really just want someone to talk to and figure that out. And it's hard enough trying to express everything that you're feeling inside in English. And so to even try to begin communicating that in Korean, it was just impossible. And so I just felt so much frustration towards language.
Yeah. No, I can totally relate with that. I mean, I use Google Translate to this day to communicate with my mom. Thank you, Google. Thank you for the free translations. That has really helped my relationship with my mother.
Let us know if you want to sponsor us.
Yeah, let us know if you want to sponsor us. You can slide into our DMs. I was just wondering, I know maybe this is going back into one of our old questions, but, when we talk about like jealousy with like people, one thing I was really jealous about seeing other kids have was when they got a packed lunch and they had a note in it. Especially when they had a note in it, I was just so jealous.
Wow.
Because, my parents never had the time to really pack me a lunch. They're always working. So, like, I'm always eating cafeteria food. I mean, like, they be loading that cart up. Thank you, Mom. But, like, sometimes I don't want the hot meal. I want that sandwich and that note that says, I love you. Have a great day at school. I'm thinking about you. And I remember just seeing, like, those little kids opening up their lunchbox, and they're like cool lunch boxes too, and they would have a note inside, and I just remember feeling this immense amount of jealousy. It's just like, why can't Mom do that for me? But she was doing that for me in a very different way. She was going to work, and she was just doing what she had to do to give us a roof over our heads, food on the table. So I mean, I think when we talk about jealousy, I think that's one thing that I remember as a kid that I like really was jealous about. But one thing I will say, thank you, Annie, because, for any older Asian sisters out there or brothers, maybe more sisters because mine is a sister. But thank you, Annie, for packing me lunch those times and writing me a note. She actually did that for me because, my sister was like my second mom. She took care of us. And I remember like I told her like, oh, I kind of wish I had like lunch for school and like a note. And I don't know. My sister's just really creative too. So she like would look up like spaghetti recipes. I mean, it was really easy. It wasn't really much of anything. She just got Prego sauce and dry noodles. But she made me spaghetti, I remember. And she wrote me a note. And I remember that just like made my day.
Oh, yeah.
So thanks, Sunny.
Yeah, my brother didn't do that. Yeah, no, but I'm a second child, and so I do give props to my brother though, because like we were home alone when we were like in elementary school, and he was responsible for the both of us, and the fact that I came out unscathed from that is a miracle. So yeah, thank you to all the older siblings out there who had to be mini parents to us younger siblings. We appreciate you.
We so appreciate you.
Yeah. So now that we're older and wiser, and I think a lot of the things that we said, it's in retrospect, right? Where it's like, oh, when I was a kid, I couldn't understand what my parents were going through, and therefore I received a lot of hurt from all of this. Yeah. But then when we like talk about our parents now, we're like, oh, they were so hardworking. I think that's because we come to see them from an adult perspective, right? Yeah. And as much as I appreciate them, though, there are definitely some things where I'm just like, yeah, that wasn't good. And so I love my parents, but I also know that they're not perfect, right? Yeah. So I'm just curious, because we're talking about how great our parents are. Like, let's like bring them back down their high horse, like let's just be like, okay, you guys are great, but not that great. They're like all like being like, yes, I was an amazing parent. Like, hold on a second. Yeah. So I just want to know, like, what is one lesson that you've learned from your parents that you realized wasn't right and you're trying to unlearn it right now?
Trying to achieve that social status and have like a prestigious title. My success, like my definition of success is so different to what their idea of success was. Yeah. So for me, it's just like, that's what I'm undoing. I'm unlearning that idea of what is success. It's so much broader than just being specific to one type of role or,
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point where when you're saying that you made your own way towards success, isn't that exactly what our parents did too? Exactly. Is they didn't follow the traditional route, but they moved halfway across the world to pave their own way.
Yeah, and I feel like it's like they don't give themselves enough credit. That's one thing I want to unlearn. To learn how to like give a pat pat on my back.
Yeah.
Because they don't do that for themselves.
Yeah.
Did you ever notice that? Like, they don't appreciate themselves the way that they should appreciate themselves. Like, they need to give them more credit of like, well, they do when they get mad at us.
That's when they like start listing out, I sacrificed this for you and I did this for you. I almost died doing this for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm trying to unlearn from my parents is that practical aspect where not everything that I enjoy has to be practical or productive or useful.
Yeah.
And I say that because I realized that for the majority of my life, I had such a strong connection to food, and I was a very unhealthy emotional eater because of it. And so earlier I mentioned that I grew up in a pretty poor family, and with that, it meant that like anytime I asked my parents for new toys or clothes, like they just could never say yes to those things. And I eventually stopped asking, but like the one thing that I could ask for that my mom almost never said no to was food, because it served two purposes where it's like, yeah, I feel good when I eat food. And then also like it gives me a full belly. So she doesn't have to worry about a meal. And so it kills two birds with one stone. So sometimes I'd like manipulate the situation where I'll ask my mom and be like, can I have this new toy? And of course she'll say no. And then it would make her feel guilty because she does want to buy me that toy. But she just can't. Smart. And then I'd be like, well, can we get McDonald's for dinner then? And then she'd be like, yes, you know? Anyway, I think like food is very central to many cultures. Like everyone has like their national dish and whatever. And I think Korean parents in particular show love to their kids with food. Like when our parents were growing up, like they grew up in a post-Korean War time. And so like food was very precious to them and it meant a lot more to them. Like they could tell how their family was doing depending on what was on the table, right? And so food is just such a big part of our parents' culture and their upbringing. And so even now, like my parents don't really say like, oh, I love you so much, like 사랑해. Like they will every once in a while, but almost like every other day, I'll get like a random text from my mom and I'll just be like, did you eat lunch yet? And it's not like she's concerned that I'm hungry, but it's her way of being like, hey, I care about you and I love you and I'm thinking about you. And it sounds really sweet. But again, like as I was talking to you about this before, is that it had a very negative effect on me growing up because I became this emotional eater where it's like every time I was stressed out, and you know, we both grew up in a very stressful environment, I would start eating because that to me just gave positive emotions. And it's just like I am constantly trying to break out of that where I would stop using food. And I remember like I used to get really bad hangry tantrums where like the moment I felt hungry, I was just so irritated all the time. And it was because eventually what ended up happening is that the feeling of hunger was associated with the feeling of pain and not being able to get what I wanted. And so to make that go away, I had to eat something. So I know that like this love for food, like so many Korean people love food. Like there's so many Korean foodies out there. But I also kind of wonder how many of us are emotional eaters because we were taught that if we're fed food, we're loved.
That's such a good point. I think I might be in a... I'm trying to think about this. Maybe not so much anymore, but I definitely was before. So you know how I told you like my mom like never really like packed me lunch when I was like little? But like her way of making up for that was like actually in high school. So like my family went through a very hard time financially. So, you know, we kind of like, I don't want to go into detail, but we went through a hard time. And I remember like my mom, like it was high school and she like made these sandwiches, like American sandwiches. Like I was like, wow. I was like impressed. I'm like, you got wheat bread, not white. You got wheat bread.
The wheat bread.
The wheat. And then you put in the American cheese with the ham and the lettuce and the tomato. Don't forget the onions. She did the works, y'all.
Wow.
I'm like, yeah. And I just remember like, wow. like that's her way of like showing that she really cares. And I just remember like being in high school but feeling like a little kid, just being like, my mom made me a sandwich, guys. I'm gonna eat my sandwich.
It's just crazy like how much we love food.
I know.
And when you really think about it, it really impacts your life in such intertwining and deep ways. So I guess on the flip side, like the last question that I have then is, so there's things to unlearn, but what is one thing that you've learned from your parents that you want to live and pass on to the next generation of people that you meet?
I think they really instilled the idea of family and respecting your elders and honoring your ancestors. I really want to teach my children that too, because I think it's so important. And I honestly don't really feel like that's embedded as much in American culture. Because I think it's important to remember like where your family came from, what they did, what their struggles were. Like it's our stories, you know, and if we don't remember, who's gonna?
Yeah.
Like I know I reference a lot of TV, but I always think of like Coco now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that movie totally made me cry. Pixar always makes me cry. But, like, I just remember, like, how important it was for their picture to be displayed on the Day of the Dead. Because that's their way of being remembered.
Yeah.
And it just made me think about, like, in comparison to Korean culture, chesa. And, like, just respecting your ancestors in that way. And that's something I want to keep as tradition because I think it's so important.
Yeah.
And other than that, like, I guess the next thing that I really want to keep forever is just, like, how generous my parents are. Like, they might not be people with, like, a lot of money, but they are very generous people.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I really admire about them. How about for you?
I think what I've learned from my parents is that there are very different ways to express love. And it's important to understand and notice how people show their love to you. So we talked about food, and I think, you know, looking back, like my parents really did try to show love to my brother and me as much as they could. And then I think also because of that, I also learned to just let people know more and make it obvious of how much I appreciate them and love them too, because I think a lot of the hurt that I received from my childhood, a lot of it was due to misunderstanding and miscommunication. And so even now, like it's so funny because I think my non-Asian friends are a lot more comfortable when I give them compliments.
Yeah.
But the Asian ones are the ones that make it really awkward, where I'd be like, hey, you, my Asian friend whose last name is Kim, Park, Cha, Chang,
Lee.
or Lee. I appreciate you. Yeah. And I love that you are so good at making presentations, or like you're so good at hosting, and they just don't know what to do. And I think it's hilarious.
Yeah.
But I also genuinely mean it. And I think it's so important to always reinforce and tell the people that you love that you really appreciate them and that you're really thankful for them.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. I think that's it is really beautiful because like I love when I get reassured, to be honest. It's like that reassurance wasn't there when I was a kid.
Yeah, that's what we were here to talk about today, is our experiences in growing up in immigrant families. And I know we talked very positively about our experiences, but I think it's just because as adults, we've had a little more time to process it. But there's definitely a lot of trauma to unpack because immigrant families typically have undergone so much chronic stress. And so it wasn't easy. We're not saying that we loved growing in an immigrant family and it was like the most perfect experience ever. It was far from perfect. We all have our wounds from it. But all I can say is that it truly shaped us into who we are today. And again, I think the theme that we just keep coming back to in our episodes is that we got to share our stories. You know, you matter. You're important to this country. your parents brought you here for whatever reason, you know, to start a life here and invest your life in here. So what I want to leave everyone with for this week is just take some time and reflect on your story and think about, you know, what was it like growing up in your family? What were some challenges? What were some highlights? And how have your view of your parents changed over time? And if you have anything that you want to share with us where you could either relate or bring a different perspective, like, we'd definitely love to hear from you.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for our 4th episode. We hope you guys like it. Please let us know what you think. But before we close, as promised, I wanted to mention a small business that is owned by Adeline Co. It's called Sabbatical Beauty. She was inspired by the DIY beauty scene, so she decided to start making her own skincare. And as a result, she shared it with her friends. And resoundingly, her friends reported that her products achieved amazing results very quickly, diminishing redness, helping acne, filling in fine lines and wrinkles. So please check it out. It's called Sabbatical Beauty. It's sabbaticalbeauty.com. The handles for their Instagram and TikTok is the same, Sabbatical Beauty. And the nice thing about this also is that if you sign up for their email list, you'll get 10% off for your first purchase, free domestic shipping over $125 spent, premium customer support, and supportive Facebook community. And just to let you know, there are verified reviews on this site as well. So please check out their website. Thank you so much, Adeline, for reaching out to us. We love that you wanted us to share your company. And yeah, until next time, don't forget that we also have handles as well, Instagram and TikTok. Visit us at The Gift of Present. We're on Spotify. We're on SoundCloud. Next week's topic will also be covering more about AAPI. So please join us and stay tuned. And other than that, thank you guys so much. See ya, love ya, and ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.